Mr David Limbrick, MLC.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister and team again for appearing. I'd like to direct my first question to Chief Commissioner Patton, please. So something that I've been querying about a lot during this inquiry, and I asked Professor Sutton about it the other week, was this idea that the public health directions, when they're made up, they must consider proportionality and they must be the least restrictive of rights. Now, the issue that I've got is that when the public health team draws up these things and imagines the least restrictive rights that they're going to have a direction for, the actual restrictions on rights are not caused by the public health team. They actually happen with Victoria Police. And when I queried the CHO about this, and the specific example I gave was a protest outside on Cup Day, which I'm sure the Commissioners are familiar with, he didn't seem to have he wasn't even aware that that was happening. And, when I asked him about that, well, how does these, the rights that you're imagining being limited might be quite different to the reality, his response was, well, that's, Victoria Police's job. Like, how do you manage that sort of, I know you spoke this morning about, communication with the CHO and this sort of thing, but it still seems like there's this gap between what the directions imagine the limitations on rights will be and the actual reality on the ground when they're enforced.
Could you just give me a bit more of an example of what you mean that gap actually is, please?
Well, okay, so if there was a protest happening on that, like was happening on that day, and the enforcement tactics that were used where the people were surrounded and compressed together, that didn't seem like something that would have been imagined when the public health directions were drawn up. And, in my mind, I would have imagined that the Chief Health Officer would have given some, guidance or something on how these directions, he expects them to be enforced or expects them to happen, but he wasn't even aware of it in this case, and it seemed like there was some sort of communication issue going on there.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's necessarily the case. I do understand your concerns, and human rights is one of the key factors we consider in any policing operation we do. I actually chair a Human Rights Strategic Advisory Committee that's made up of quite eminent persons in this state who provide advice to Victoria Police so that we can take on board and learn and get better where we have had failings in the past. But in terms of every operation that we run, we have an operation order, and human rights is a key factor in every one of those matters. Of course, it's made more complex with the overlay of COVID-19 and the imposition of the Chief Health Officer guidelines. But I want to be really clear. The Chief Health Officer guidelines apply to everybody, and they're not just segmented to protests. They're about limiting numbers of movement. It was all about movement in any shape or form. And the fact that people have chosen to demonstrate when that was prohibited, and at that times it was virtually totally prohibited. It was totally prohibited in terms of numbers. People have chosen to breach those CHO directions. And so when you talk about human rights, I want to talk about the human rights of the community in general and everyone else who's doing the right things. So we absolutely consider human rights in our enforcement. We did on that day. In the lead up to all of these events, I think we issued something like over the journey 100 letters where we went to people saying, you are breaching the Chief Health Officer guidelines. You cannot do this. You may be arrested. You may be charged with incitement, which is an indictable offence. In addition to that, on the day that you're talking about, we again warned them not to participate in those events. They did. They chose to breach the Chief Health Officer guidelines while the rest of the community weren't doing that. They had a mass gathering which potentially put the community at risk. So in light of that, we were in a position where we took action. People were cordoned, and they were then systematically arrested and processed as was the case. They were provided drinks on the day, they were allowed to sit in the shade, and they were treated as humanely as possibly could be. And we engaged with all of them, allowing anyone who was suffering any type of medical condition to be dealt with first of all. But the reality is we are very cognizant of human rights. We appreciate human rights as a key factor in everything we do in policing, and we absolutely want it to be a vital factor for confidence from the community. But I don't think there's any gap in the CHO directions and the way we enforce them. The reality is those CHO directions were there to restrict exactly what occurred on this day.
Thank you, Commissioner. And with that in mind, though, like, there's been other protests as well. So another protest that I witnessed back in June, which was the concerning Aboriginal deaths in custody, larger protest. But what was the reason that this was treated so differently? Because there's been a lot of questions put to me. So, you know, at one protest, and I actually thought that the police managed that protest very, very well. I've said that publicly a number of times. I thought it was, you know, people were allowed to exercise their right to free assembly. People were kept apart as much as they could. They were breaching the CHO guidelines, but police were very professional and let them do their thing. But the reaction to the other protest on Cup Day was quite different, even though the directions were not a lot different. I think back in June was a limit of 20 people, and in November it was a limit of 10 people. What drives the difference in the policing of these events?
I think the circumstances were vastly different. I think when we had the protest that you're referring to that I've just spoken of, I don't think anyone was allowed out in groups at that stage. I stand to be corrected, but I believe that to be the case. Or if it was maximum of 10.
I think it was 10.
Okay, yeah, sure. Yeah. Significantly more than that, though, on that day. But the June Black Lives Matter protest, and I've spoken about this publicly on numerous occasions, we said before it occurred, we do not support it occurring. It will be illegal and it will breach the Chief Health Officer guidelines. But the circumstances where we were at that time in terms of if you like, the COVID environment, the spread was very low at that stage. We hadn't just gone through a whole range of lockdowns and everything you like, so the circumstances were totally different. But I think one of the primary key factors in, we eventually made a decision to reluctantly allow that Black Lives Matter to go ahead because of the emotion that was in the community, because of the emotion that was being displayed across the world, and because of what we'd seen in other communities across the world. We'd seen arson, we'd seen looting, we'd seen assaults, we'd seen cities, and I'm sure everyone here has seen the reporting on the news, that were damaged and continue to this day still suffer the impact economically and from a reputational point of view. So my major concern at that time, as a Deputy Commissioner then, we said this should not occur. But we had over 10,000, between 10 and 20,000 people who were intent on marching. So my main aim at that stage was on public order, to ensure public order so this city could then get back on with its role. That's what we did. We did fine the organisers of that protest because we told them this should not occur and we will fine you, and we did that. But they're vastly different events at vastly different times in different scenarios with different underlying factors involved.
Thank you. With regards to, you mentioned incitement. So, you know, if we had a limit of 20 people back in June, 10 in November and 100 people now, usually the objective of a protest is to get a lot of people, and usually the organisers of a protest can't control, they don't have no practical means of controlling the number of people that would turn up. You know, they might advertise it, they say we're having a protest on this day, and then people come along. How can an organiser, in practical terms, organise a protest without risking being charged with incitement? Even if they said, you know, we only want 100 people to turn up, they can't guarantee that they can do that. Is there, I'm not sure if there's a practical means through which they can avoid being charged with incitement.
Look, I think the people we've charged with incitement are people who incited a protest when they weren't allowed to have protests, full stop. Not allowed to protest because it would have been a breach. And they put on Facebook, they advertise, they make a range of representations saying, we're going to have a protest here, we're going to do this. We go and say, no, you cannot do that. It's against the law. You're committing an indictable offence. Here's a letter telling you can't do it. Take it down. And on occasions, they've listened to us and taken it down, and we say, that's great. And then the thing peters out and we've done our job. But people who've disregarded it, we've just continued on and we've charged them. As I've said before, we're not anti-protest. We're happy for people to voice their opinions and demonstrate peacefully, and we will support that and we'll continue to do moving forward. But I make no apologies for the actions that we took in stopping movement that should not have occurred and that was unlawful because of the CHO guidelines.
Thank you. So if I advertised a protest now and I said I only want 100 people to turn up and go ahead with, and maybe I liaise with police to say, I'm going to have this protest, presumably more than 100 people would turn up. I still don't understand how in practical terms people can exercise this right and without risking incitement charges.
Look, there's a complexity to what you're describing, if that's the case, yes, but we have seen it occur, and we have seen it occur successfully out at the Mantra Hotel out at Preston, for example, where there are refugee protests occur regularly, and we have worked with those people to make sure that they come within the cap of that. But we can't allow the breach to occur and grow and suddenly have 5,000 people because it will again put at risk the health of the other people in the community. So yeah, there is complexity with it. Your point is right, but we try and do our best.
Thank you. And maybe my next question's for the Minister. You mentioned earlier this morning about how the state of emergency is required for quarantine. Why can't there be new legislation specifically to manage the quarantine? Why do we need to lean on the state of emergency for the entire quarantine period? Because, I mean, my concern is that if we're going to have quarantine for longer than expected, which may be the case, and we were talking like 12-month contracts at least, are we really planning on having a state of emergency that long? Like, why can't we draw up specific legislation just to manage the quarantine?
Firstly, I'd say, I think I mentioned before, the state of emergency at the moment is for more than hotel quarantine. So, just to do COVID-safe plans require businesses, limits on restaurants. So that is not changing yet. So we need the state of emergency powers to enforce around those directions. Look, I wouldn't rule it out either, but let's see what happens in terms of, the state of emergency is providing a number of protections at the moment.
Thank you, Minister.